Now, for those of you who haven't been here when I've been here, now admittedly I haven't been here for a while, we've been working our way through the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. And Nehemiah is really most well known for the task that he undertook to oversee the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. But the last half of the book really deals with other aspects of his life and ministry. And those are things that tend to be overlooked and tend to be forgotten. And I think it's important for us that we do actually see the whole thing, rather than just see him for this one job that we all remember him for. So I've got a question for you as we start. When was the last time you went to the doctors for a checkup? You go to the doctors and probably a nurse these days would do a kind of MOT on your health. And usually they do 3 simple tests. First thing they do is they feel your pulse. So they put their hand on your wrist and they feel a pulse and they use their watch. And they're trying to work out whether your heart is beating at the right speed, whether your heart is beating regularly. Because from that they can tell a few things. Then the nurse will usually take a thermometer and put it in your ear and go beep, and it records the temperature on your inner ear, core temperature. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to see whether your temperature has gone up, because that might indicate that you've actually got an infection that maybe you didn't even know of. Next, she gets another thing out, which I love the name of, the sphygmomanometer, and it's got a big cuff, and they put it on your arm, and then these days they just press the button, and it goes, and it blows up, and then it goes down. And then it records on the little screen your high blood pressure, your systolic, and then your low blood pressure, your diastolic. And what they're looking for, of course, is if you've got high blood pressure, that indicates that maybe your arteries are a bit furred up, or that your heart is under stress. Or if your blood pressure is low, well, maybe you've got some blood loss that you didn't know anything about, or maybe you're just dehydrated. But those are all things they're kind of looking at. And as a result of that, they might make some recommendations. They might say you should have some further tests. They might prescribe some medication. But there are some conditions that are actually quite difficult to sort. And sometimes we think you've got rid of those conditions and they come back. I think, oh no, I thought we got rid of them once. And the same is true in the spiritual realm. The same is true with the health of our hearts before God. We can address some things and then they come back. And we think to ourselves, hold on a minute, I thought I got rid of that and now it's back. And that is exactly the scenario that we have here in chapter 13 of Nehemiah. We saw last time that repentance is at the heart of true revival. And we saw the people of God putting right the things that they got wrong. We saw that they confessed their sins to God. And then they entered into a covenant with God. And they wrote out this covenant, and then they signed their names that they were going to keep this covenant. It's all there in chapter 10. And things were looking up. Things were looking healthy. But then, for some reason, Nehemiah, probably because it was written into his contract, he had to return back to Artaxerxes in Babylon, where he was the king's cupbearer. So he returned back to his duties back in Babylon. And after a while, he persuades the king, oh, no, can I go back? And eventually he gets permission to return to Jerusalem. And when he comes back, he discovers that things are not quite right with the people of God. Their spiritual health has taken a bit of a nosedive since he left. And actually, they've relapsed into the same problems that they'd previously repented of. Now, I want us to consider the end of chapter 10 and chapter 13 together, because there is this linkage between what happens in chapter 13 and what had previously happened in chapter 10. And as we do so, I want to use the three things that are highlighted in this chapter as a bit of a spiritual checkup for ourselves. Now, of course, when you have a checkup, you might discover that things are okay. That's good. But you might discover that there are things, well, maybe we just need to give some attention to that. We need to put that bit straight. So I'm not coming here with these three things saying these are all wicked things that you're all doing. No, this is a checkup, right? Everything might be okay. But let's just consider these three things that are revealed to us in the 13th chapter of Nehemiah. First point, first checkup. Marrying unbelievers, a sign of spiritual heart disease. That's the first thing. Now, if we go back to chapter 10, we discover that the first thing on the list of the things that they signed to was this. In chapter 10, verse 30, that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. First thing, they would not intermarry with unbelievers. They wouldn't intermarry with people of the nations around them. Now, of course, this was specifically forbidden in the law of Moses. So if you go back to Exodus chapter 34, you find these words in verse 12. Take heed to thyself, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land whither thou goest, lest it be for a snare in the midst of thee. And then we go on to verse 16, verse 15, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they go a whoring after their gods, and do sacrifice unto their gods, and one call thee, and thou eat of his sacrifice, and thou take of their daughters unto thy sons, and their daughters go a whoring after their gods, and make thy sons go a whoring after their gods. Thou shalt make thee no molten gods. So there is the reason that believing people were not to marry unbelieving people was for religious grounds, so that the people of God did not commit spiritual adultery. They didn't abandon Jehovah in order to worship the dumb, man-made gods of the surrounding nations. Now, clearly, marrying the people that were worshipping those gods was a step towards worshipping those gods. And this is the problem that's now arisen in chapter 13. And it really is a heart problem. It reflects a divided heart. A heart that's got a bit for God and a bit for what God has said no to. Now, this is a particularly bad problem and particularly widespread in the people of God. If you read the 10th chapter of Ezra, the previous book, you will discover that he writes out a register of all the people who have married outside of the people of God. It's a register of shame. But it was deep-seated. It wasn't just widespread, it was deep-rooted. Even the priests had married outside of the people of God. So if you if you see there in Ezra chapter 16, you find earlier in chapter 6 of Nehemiah, you discover these words. Chapter 6, verse 17, moreover, in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah. Now you'll remember that name. Well, wasn't he one of the people who was kind of causing so much aggro to Nehemiah at the beginning? They sent letters to Tobiah, and letters of Tobiah came to them, and there were many in Judah sworn unto him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Ara, and his son, Johanan, had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. He was one of the priests. His daughter was married to the son of Tobiah. But not just that. The last portion of chapter 13 of Nehemiah records this. One of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, that's the grandson of the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat, the Horonite. This is unbelievable. Here we have the high priests allied to the very worst, most inveterate enemies of the people of God. It almost beggars belief. It's almost unbelievable. This was not only contrary to the general instruction not to marry outside, but was also contrary to the very specific instruction given to priests. In Leviticus, we are told they are to take a wife in her virginity, a widow or a divorced woman or profane or a harlot, these shall they not take, but they shall take a virgin of his own people to wife. They were only to marry from their own people, specifically told that. And what is the word that Nehemiah uses? They have defiled the priesthood. They've defiled it. They've made it dirty. And what was the effect? What was the effect of this marrying outside? The effect was that foreign languages were now spoken in Jerusalem. So much so that the boys and girls in Jerusalem couldn't speak Hebrew anymore. And of course, if they couldn't speak Hebrew anymore, they couldn't understand Scripture anymore. The Bible was now a closed book to them. So what was to be done? Nehemiah decided decisive action had to be taken. And Nehemiah was a man of decisive action. What does he do? He storms into the temple and he empties all the household belongings of Tobiah and he chucks it all outside. I'm not having that. Out. Out it goes. He throws all the stuff out. He contends with the people. I mean, you read it and you think, I wouldn't like to mess with Nehemiah. But there it is, verse 25. I contended with them and cursed them and smote certain of them and plucked off their hair and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves. And then, as for this grandson of the high priest, he says, I chased him from me. I drove him out of my presence. So, that's all a bit extreme, isn't it? It's a bit of an overreaction, is it? Doesn't that remind you of someone else? I was listening to an interview with President Netanyahu, and he referred to this, to Jesus, the rabbi from Galilee, who came into the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers. He referred to it. And what did it say? The zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. And that's Nehemiah, zealous for the house of God. Now, this is now becoming a problem in our churches. Believers marrying non-believers. And the New Testament is clear on it. Listen to Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? Or what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. That's pretty clear. Now, clearly there are some who are married before they come to faith. This is not what this is addressing. What this is addressing is people who are already in faith, who deliberately and willfully marry someone who they know is not a believer. Now I know what the arguments are. There's not enough men in the church. We need to win them for Christ, as if marriage is some form of evangelism. You know, we in the church, we used to be clear on this. But now we're kind of there's an embarrassed silence about it. And now the church is in disarray over it. And what's the result? Chaos at home. Chaos over the teaching of the Word of God to children. The children can no longer speak the language of heaven. They have no communication with God and no hearing of the Word. What is the other consequence? The heartbreak of divorce. Listen, God has spoken. But problem is, we think we know better. Haven't we listened to Solomon? That was Nehemiah's argument. Are we wiser than Solomon? Solomon made this mistake. Are we stronger than Samson? Samson made this mistake. Are we godlier than David? David made this mistake. Listen, this represents heart trouble, a divided heart. Are our hearts divided by other loves? Remember, friendship with the world is enmity with God. That's how John puts it in his first epistle. First test then. Marrying unbelievers, a sign of spiritual heart disease. Second test. Profaning the Sabbath, a sign of spiritual infection. Now, we've taken the pulse. Now we need to put the thermometer in our ears and test ourselves to see whether there's any sign of infection. And the second undertaking of the covenant that they signed in chapter 10 was this. Verse 31, and if the people of the land bring ware or victuals on the Sabbath day to sell, that means provisions, daily provisions to sell, that we would not buy it of them on the Sabbath or on the holy day, and that we would lead the 7th year and the exaction of every debt. So that was it. They promised to observe the 4th commandment. Now let's just remind ourselves of the 4th commandment. There it is, Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. I'm going to read it in full. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labour and do all thy work, But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor the stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. He made it special, separate, holy for himself. Now, these people in Nehemiah's day, in chapter 10, they make a promise to God that they sign. And the promise is specifically about trading on the Sabbath. But when Nehemiah comes back, he discovers that they've kind of slid back on their promise. The technical word is recidivism. They've returned to reoffending. Now, they've returned to their old ways, and it's there in chapter 13, verse 15. In those days, I saw in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and lading asses, and also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. They were selling their daily provisions, buying and selling daily provisions. Now, two things here. Firstly, they were engaged in harvesting work on the Sabbath day, something expressly forbidden in Exodus 34. Second thing, they were buying from mobile traders, something they had specifically promised they would not do. What is this? It's a clear sign they've got some sort of spiritual infection. They've got a bit of a temperature running. What did it represent? What did it indicate? They had contempt for the special sign that the Sabbath was of God's favour to them. Now I want you to understand this bit. Exodus 31 tells us something about the point and the purpose of the Sabbath in the lives of the people of God. Chapter 31, verse, let's see, where should we start? Verse 15. 6 days may work be done, but in the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. Now that tells you how serious God took it. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. Now here it is. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. A sign. Now the prophet Ezekiel returns to that idea in chapter 20. Where he says this, I gave them my statutes, verse 11, and showed them my judgments, which if a man do, he may live in them. Moreover, also I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. Keeping the Sabbath was a special sign of the relationship between God and his people. To abandon that sign meant contempt for the relationship between God and his people. And this was a major cause of the judgment that had already come upon Jerusalem. These are the words of Jeremiah in this context. Jeremiah chapter 17. Thus saith the Lord, take heed to yourselves, Bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. Neither carry forth a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day. Neither shall you do any work, but hallow the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. But they obeyed not, neither inclined their ear, but made their neck stiff, that they might not hear nor receive instruction. And it shall come to pass, if ye diligently hearken unto me, saith the Lord, to bring no burden through the gates of the city on the Sabbath day, but hallow the Sabbath day to do it and to do no work therein, then shall there enter into the gates of this city kings and princes. But then, if you will not hearken unto me to hallow the Sabbath day, and not to bear a burden, even entering in the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then will I kindle a fire in the gates thereof, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched. And that is exactly what had happened to the city. That was what the beginning of Nehemiah is all about. So again, in this context, Nehemiah is decisive. So right, this is the problem. We've got to take decisive action. What does he do? He contends with the nobles, the businessmen. He says, we've got to stop this. He reminds them of the judgment of God that had come on them because they had disobeyed. And then he shuts the gates. Now remember, the Jews count the day to begin at sundown. The Sabbath begins at sundown on Friday night. So as soon as the sun was going down, he shut the gates. He set his servants to watch the gates and said, don't open them until the Sabbath's finished. Nobody's going in and out. We'll stop that. And then what happens? Well, the traders, they come and camp outside the walls a couple of Sabbath days. And he thought, well, they'll learn. But they still clearly don't learn because they want to make money. So he threatens them. He says, if you come here again, I'll arrest you lot and clap you in irons. He said, all right, we won't come again. So they don't. And then he does something else. He calls the Levites. He says, right, I want you to watch the gates, and I want you to make this people going in and out as part of a holy event, a holy day, so that worshippers can come in, worshippers can go out. I want you to make this day a holy day for God. Now, how does that relate to us? Well, sadly, there is now great confusion in our churches about the Sabbath. We live in an increasingly secular society in which any observance of the Sabbath just appears quaint, and we don't want to appear quaint. Once, we were very clear on this in the church. There were two types of work that were permissible on the Sabbath: works of mercy and works of necessity. They were legitimate. But now, anything else can be done on a Sunday. Christians can work in being a truck driver. They can do that on a Sunday. Christians can work in teaching, and they can do their marking on a Sunday. Anything goes now. But it's not just what you do in terms of work. Christians will jet off on holiday on a Sunday, making somebody else work. Christians will turn out of church and go to the corner shop to get their provisions, their victuals, or an ice cream. Christians will turn out of church and go to a restaurant for Sunday lunch, making loads of other people work. Christians will go home on a Sunday, put their feet up, turn on the telly and watch the footy or the Formula One. Is this keeping the Sabbath day holy? Is this sanctifying the day for God? And then inside the church, I'm not saying it happens here, but there are people in our churches who take a dim view of traders coming to their door on a Sunday, and yet they'll go to the bookstall at the back of the church and they'll buy books on a Sunday. Doesn't that seem a little bit inconsistent? We must avoid double standards. Now, of course, there are many in our churches who are saying, oh, hold on a minute, there's no such thing as the Sabbath anymore. That command is not repeated in the New Testament. It doesn't apply to us anymore. But they're willfully forgetting this is one of the 10 sentences, one of the only 10 sentences in the Bible that was written with the finger of God in stone. And that the basis and the argument for it was what? Creation. That's the argument in Exodus 20, and that's the argument in Exodus 31. Creation. God rested on the Sabbath and hallowed it. He was refreshed. And that's why he gives it, for us to be refreshed. When the people of God are openly flouting one of the 10 commandments, the church is in trouble. We are sick of a fever. We need to return to what we once did. We are the redeemed people of God. Who were the people who were told to keep the 10 commandments? Who were they given to? The people whom God had redeemed from the land of Egypt. Has God redeemed us? The 10 commandments are for us, including the 4th one. Profaning the Sabbath, a sign of spiritual infection. Thirdly, neglecting the kingdom, a sign of spiritual hypotension, or that's a technical word, low blood pressure. The third undertaking of the covenant in Nehemiah chapter 10 was this. Also, we made ordinances for us to charge ourselves, verse 32, yearly for the third part of the shekel of the service of the house of God. And then it goes on as a list of things that they're going to do for the service of the house of our God. We are going to provide for the work of God. They were going to give. They were going to give money, they were going to give sacrifices, they were going to give the first fruits of the land, they were going to give their tithes. What for? How does that end? It ends by saying, verse 39, and we will not forsake the house of our God. That's it. That's the purpose of this. But by chapter 13 and verse 10, the house of God is neglected. The Levites have abandoned their roles in the house of God. And they've returned to their fields. They've given up their ministry. They're seeking an alternative way to put bread on the table. And this, of course, is a downward spiral. Because once the absentee Levites are no longer doing what they should be doing in the temple, well, the people who go to the temple feel less inclined to give money to support them. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, a kind of circle that's going downwards. And when the house of our God takes low priority in the minds of the people of God have got very low blood pressure. They are dehydrated. They are facing imminent collapse. And Nehemiah says, right, drastic action is needed. What does he do? Well, it's interesting that the stuff that Tobias had in the temple was put in one of the rooms that was designated for receiving the tithes and offerings. So I'm not having that. Out. And he throws it all out. He says, right, sanctify the room. Let's get the room back to what it was meant for. Put it back into its proper use. And let's invite the people to bring their gifts. It's not that the people are unwilling. They then start coming to bring their gifts. Now, the church is under obligation. There is an obligation between God's people and God's servants, between the ministers and the people in the congregation. If we're going to get the best from our ministers, they need to be fully paid so they are not distracted by other tasks. How many ministers in our churches are failing for lack of financial support? So they're kind of worried about how else do I put bread on the table? But of course, this is a two-way street. How many ministers are not giving their best because they're willfully distracted by family responsibilities or aspects of family life or other things like home education? And they're distracted from the role that they should be giving in ministering the word. Isn't this the idea that Paul gives to us in 1 Timothy? Let elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honour, especially they who labour in the word and doctrine. So those that do a good job should get rewarded. Those who don't shouldn't. That's a bit harsh, isn't it? But that's what Paul says. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you give to the work of the Lord in Treharris? Do you give to support God's work in this place? You say, well, I'd love to, but how much do I give? I mean, we don't really talk about money, do we? But, how much should I give? Well, the basic principle is recorded for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Verse 1, now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye, upon the first day of the week, i.e. Sunday, today, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. First principle then is I give in proportion to my income. Okay? So those people who earn more, give more. Those people who earn less, give less. That's the basic principle. So you might say, okay, I've heard the word in Nehemiah, the word tithe. Should I tithe? Should I give a tenth? Well, there's no hard and fast rule in the New Testament about that. But remember two things. Firstly, that tithing was in the law of Moses, but tithing began before the law of Moses. So Abraham, he gave a tithe to Melchizedek. Jacob promised God a tithe when he saw the ladder going up into heaven. Tithe. And also note that tithing in the Old Testament was associated with really amazing blessings. The 3rd chapter of Malachi puts it like this. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith. You might say, oh, that's a bit risky, supporting the work of God in that way. Prove me now herewith, saith the Lord, if I will not open to you the windows of heaven, and pour out a blessing, there shall not be room enough to receive it. God said, go on then, put me to the test. You give, and you see what I'll give you. And God says, I'll bless you with such abundance, you won't even be able to store it up. Now, we've had a bit of a check-up this morning. We've checked against 3 things. First of all, marrying unbelievers. Is our heart divided? If it is, my friends, we need to return to our first love. We need to return to God. Secondly, are we running a temperature? Is there some sort of infection in our lives of profaning the Sabbath? We need to return to the basic principles of the Christian life, the 10 Commandments. Do we have a low spiritual blood pressure? Are we neglecting support for the work of God? Remember what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. He says this: "He which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver." Give cheerfully. Now, my friends, you've got to test yourselves. You've got to take your own pulse, put a temperature in it, probe in your ear, and you put the sphygmomanometer on your arm of your soul. How are you doing? Well, there's some stuff there we need to address. Come on, my friends. Let's put it right. Who knows what blessings God has in store for us? Amazing blessings. Let's come to him and let's listen to these tests and put things right if things need putting right. And if not, let's go on serving him with every fibre of our being. Amen. We shall sing together again. Hymn number 700. Hymn number 700. O Jesus, I have promised to serve thee to the end. Be thou forever near me, my master and my friend.